Hi, everybody. So this is the third video for this unit. The first one dealt to things basically up to the Stamp Act Congress and the Declaratory Act. The second one covered the next set of acts and tensions up until the First Continental Congress. And we're going to get into 1776 today, which of course brings the Revolutionary War. And we'll discuss a little bit about the war that did last past 1776. So I have this all laid out, but I don't want to go too long. So I'm not sure if this is going to be one video or two, but we shall see. So today we're going to start off with common sense, and I'm not going to get too much into it because we are going to be reading parts of this in class. So Thomas Paine was one of our founding fathers, even though he was English born and didn't come to America until 1774, right before our revolution. He was a political theorist and a philosopher, and common sense was not new ideas, but it embraced Enlightenment ideals of human rights. He actually signed it by an Englishman, just to sort of prove his point that even an Englishman would see the need for independence if the people's rights aren't being respected. Uh, this pamphlet gets a lot of credit for convincing a lot of the colonists to support independence because a lot of them weren't. A lot of them didn't want to go that far. John Adams, who we all know becomes our president eventually, wrote about how the revolution was actually fought before the war and that the revolution was the changing in people's minds and the ideologies behind the revolution. And Adams gave Thomas Paine here a lot of credit for that, for switching people's minds. One of the ways that Thomas Paine did it is because he appealed to a lot of people's widespread convictions. So it wasn't like haughty, deep philosophies. He did things like make references to the Old Testament. And this is right after the Great Awakening. And there was a lot of religious fervor in the Americas. And that was a good way to appeal to a lot of the populace at the time. Now, Philadelphia is one of my favorite places in the world, and maybe yours as well. And if you go around Philadelphia, there's so many places preserved. Independence Hall, Carpenter's Hall, the Betsy Ross House, right? We can go on and on and on. Well, where Common Sense was printed is now a parking lot. It's the corner of Chancellor and South Street. And it's just interesting to see what do we decide to preserve and what do we deserve or what do we think deserves just, a marker, and we'll build something else there. So little thing to contemplate about. Okay, so now we have the Continental Congress meeting in the spring of 1776. So at the time, England was embargoing all trade to the colonies and ordered the seizure of all American ships. And this convinced Congress to declare its ports open to all countries, right? Not just England. So Virginia's Richard Henry Lee, a founding father as well, he introduced a resolution on June 7th calling for independence.
Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh.
I pledge.
Okay, the announcements are over. So on June 7th, he called for independence. Is this still recording? Yes, okay. A little bit about Henry Lee. He was the president of the Congress of Confederation after independence, so before our Constitution. That's pretty notable. He also was a U.S. Senator from 89 to 92, 1789 to 1792. So after he made that call for independence, they made a committee. And Jefferson was the chair of that committee. And Jefferson's committee presented the Declaration to Congress on June 28th. So you see this is all happening pretty quickly. So if it's just a matter of weeks, they already sort of had an idea for the Declaration in mind. So this, there were some changes to it, and we're going to discuss some of those changes in class. And then the final version was voted for on July 2nd. Jefferson always thought our Independence Day would be celebrated on July 2nd. So 12 delegations voted for independence. New York didn't. New York chose to abstain. And that's important because they were probably going to vote against the Declaration, right? There were a lot of loyalists in New York. But because they abstained and only 12 voted, they could still say it was a unanimous decision. So that was pretty clever, done on purpose, really. So on July 4th, Congress sent the document to the printer, and oops. And then by July 8th, it's read outside in Philadelphia. People stormed what's now known Independence Hall. So you probably know, right? Independence Hall in Philly. This is like a side view. We should see it from a different angle now. But people literally stormed in there because that was a courthouse used by the British Crown. So they took off like the coat of arms for Britain and like they throw it into a big bonfire that night. So people were pretty excited. So now we get into the war. So the British established a new headquarters in New York City at this time. As I said before, there were a lot of loyalists in New York City. In 1776, Washington tried to challenge the British for control of New York City, but he was defeated and pretty badly. By late October, the city was completely in British hands, and it would stay that way until the war ended. In the fall of 76, there were two chief commanders in North America, and they were actually brothers. General William Howe, who was quite frankly a Renaissance man. He wrote operas and all these sorts of things. And his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. And they were supposed to make a final effort to try to reconcile with the colonists so that this war would not have to be fought. The first demand for reconciliation, however, was that the colonists revoke the Declaration of Independence. And that simply wasn't happening. So there was now no hope of reconciliation. And for the next 2 years, the war swept back and forth between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, right? We all know there were many, many battles fought around here. They were also supported, the British were supported by German troops. Many people call them German mercenaries, but they really weren't mercenaries. They were fighting for their prince back in Germany, and the princes supported the British crown. So we can talk about that if you want later. So at this point, things are not going much in the colonists' favor. Washington learned a lesson in New York that his troops were no match for the British in a frontal combat, like head on, face to face. The British were doing so much better. So GW learned that he had to basically change his tactics. For one, he had to make the war as costly as possible for the British, so they didn't want to keep spending all this money. He also wanted to make sure he could protect civilians as much as possible, and that often meant trying to avoid really big battles. So an example is they sort of had the Congress escape Philadelphia. I think we discussed that on one of our On This Days. And in September of 77, the British did take Philadelphia. By October, the Americans did win an important victory at Saratoga. This was known as a gentleman's surrender because of the way that surrendered. Almost 6,000 British troops basically turned in their weapons and marched away with the understanding that they would not be attacked as they left. General Burgoyne, another sort of Renaissance man soldier, surrendered there. So what happens next? We have Congress deciding on the Articles of Confederation. We all know that was the basic structure, the document that provided the basic structure of our government until the Constitution. So the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775, and its powers were a bit unclear. Things were a bit uncertain. What could they do? How could they raise an army? How could they establish diplomatic relations? I mean, we were a country, but we really weren't a country yet. Everything was very fuzzy and not easy. So on June of 1776, right before independence was declared, Congress appointed a committee, and that was chaired by John Dickinson. And he was from Pennsylvania, and he was to draw up a plan of perpetual union. And that's where we get the Articles of Confederation. And I think we're going to start there for the next video. It's a good little transition.